Ro is from Save Women's Sport Australasia. Good morning to you, Ro.
Good morning, Michael. Welcome back to the airwaves,
Thank you so much.
It's lovely to hear you on there again.
Now, Ro, you are based in New Zealand?
Yes, I am.
And you commissioned this poll as part of a group of women to what? Ensure that men can't decide to transition and then compete.
Well, can I just take you back a bit to how we got around to deciding that we needed to commission this poll? Because I think the history is quite important. So back in 2020, we were corresponding with the New Zealand Rugby Union when they rejected World Rugby's transgender policy. It was like the first one that actually came out protecting the female category with really good research, robust consultation, and it basically said that you can't have fairness and safety for females in sport if you allow males to play the game, especially in a high-contact sport like rugby. That's really crucially important. So they invited Save Women's Sport to be part of their consultation process for the development of their own policy. And as I needed to get funding from Sport New Zealand said, look, hey, why don't we develop guiding principles for all sports at the same time? So we were involved in that consultation, and when the draft was released in May of last year, it became pretty apparent that all the feedback and research that we and the likes of Professor Alison Heather from Otago University had provided was totally ignored. In their guidelines, there's 7 guiding principles, and each one of them is only looked through the lens of transgender participants, and it completely ignores the impacts on females, on sporting volunteers, administrators and referees. But when you understand that the directive from our Sports Minister, Grant Robertson, was that inclusion had to be the starting point for any discussion about the participation of transgender people in the sex class of their choice, you kind of understand the outcomes were already predetermined. Sports New Zealand's hands were tied, like that was the directive from the Minister. However, we did our best last year to raise awareness. That resulted, we ran a campaign with a whole lot of New Zealand elite athletes who signed a letter to Grant Robertson, and we managed to get Sport New Zealand to agree to another round of consultation, which was meant to take place some time ago, but interestingly still hasn't. But earlier this year, we found out that Sport New Zealand had spent over $4.7 million on surveys over the last few years. And despite developing guidelines that would have major implications on all sports, especially on female participation levels, they'd failed to survey the sporting community about their proposed changes. So that's when we thought we need to actually find out what Kiwis think. Are we on the right side of this argument or not? So that's why we set about to fundraise and then commissioned this Curia polling to get the answers.
Well, and you've got the answers now. I find them fascinating, and so would you as well. I guess the final result I wouldn't find fascinating, that 2 of every 3 New Zealanders don't support the transitioning of men who self-identify as women going into female sport. And for the reasons that I guess, I also read that Otago professor, and I think basically the argument was, well, they have this unnatural advantage of having been a male. So all the physical characteristics that they bring to women's sport places them at a severe advantage. Is that right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Like the male advantage starts in utero and is exponentially advanced by male puberty. It supercharges. It can never be unwound or fully negated by testosterone suppression. And that was a big mistake the IOC made when they released their guidelines that actually allowed Laura Hubbard to be able to compete. Lowering testosterone doesn't change the clear advantages in skeletal structure, heart and lung size, blood oxygenation, your height, your strength, your power. It mitigates it slightly, but not enough to take away that overall advantage. So, it's interesting. The policies that have been brought out have really disadvantaged female athletes.
But the other thing about the poll that then struck me, and I sort of found scary, was when you broke the poll results down into age groups.
Yeah.
And at that stage, I mean, I couldn't believe it. But for example, my daughter, who is 17, I actually asked this question over breakfast this morning. And I said, how would you feel about it? And she said, I'd have to think about that. I don't know. I can see both sides, she said. Yet her age group, and those, under the age of 40, or is it this poll? There almost seems there is, from 18 to 39, there is support for this proposal.
Yeah, so 49%, and especially those in Auckland and Wellington, so whereas in the provincial areas, not so much. So why is that? We've had long discussions about this, and I'd say socialisation strongly impacts. This generation have been raised in this be kind age, and their age group is much more likely, therefore, to view any kind of attempt to set boundaries as being the result of bigotry or transphobia.
Mm-hmm.
And they could be afraid to risk ostracisation from their peer groups. We had a great example of that this week in the UK, where an 18-year-old female student was hounded out of her school for questioning trans ideology and saying biological sex was real. In my experience too, there's a really strong difference between young people who are giving a theoretical answer, maybe because they don't play sport or it doesn't impact them, or it hasn't yet, and then young people who do. The majority of the second are not pro-males in their sports, but I think a lot of them are just terrified of speaking out because of the potential repercussions.
No, I'm sure you're right on that one. There is that sort of, but then, can I just raise this? There are sort of people who are in the middle, aren't there? So I'm not talking about, I was born a man, I've lived my life as a man, and suddenly at 25 years of age I want to swim, so I'll become a woman. I'm talking about people like Caster Semenya, for example, who has both male and female sex organs, apparently. God knows, poor woman, she got involved in that. The 3 top placemakers, I think, in the Rio Games 800 metres are now banned from actually competing in the event because their testosterone levels are too high. What do we do with those people?
Look, the intersex debate is really, really complex. I mean, those 3 are biologically male, and had they probably been born in the likes of New Zealand, Australia, the UK, America, they probably would have been identified as being male at birth. But because of, the presentation of their bodies, they were brought up as female. It's a really complex issue with that one, but I think what we're focusing on is trans inclusion, and trans inclusion is, it's a simple biological male-female, there are no chromosomal issues there, Males are males, females are females, but it's how they identify, it's the gender they identify with, and their need to be accepted into the category of the gender they identify with.
Listen, I'm going to be a bit impolitic here, but I mean, that's my nature, you'd be used to that. The transition, like, for example, I know a couple of transsexuals, neither of whom have transitioned completely physically, so they haven't, had their male member cut off and it reinserted and all those, that particular operation. Does it make a difference to you at all if that happens? Or do you just see them, no, you were once a male, it doesn't matter whether you've gone through the whole physical transformation to become a female or not, you still shouldn't be allowed to play sport with women?
Well, can I first state that most people that are identifying as the opposite sex now have no transition whatsoever.
Yes, I'm aware of that,
So there is no physical transition. A lot of young girls are unfortunately getting their breasts chopped off, which just devastates me, but for a lot of males, they are still intact males. And I think the ones that do go through that whole process, there's probably very, very few of them that would ever get involved in sports because it is such a long and arduous process for them to go through that full transition that I don't know if there'll ever be a major impact in sport. But, ultimately they still have male biology. It's not going to change, by getting their penis chopped off is not going to change their bone structure, the size of their heart, the size of their lungs, all of those things that actually give the male advantage.
All right, but now we've got, I think, 7 New Zealand sports that have, in actual fact, signed up to allow trans females or trans males or whatever. I don't know. Sorry, I don't know what the terminology is.
We call them male transgender athletes.
Male transgender athletes.
Then it explains it very clearly because otherwise people get really confused on this issue and we see it constantly.
Okay, so they've signed up to actually allow those people to compete in those sports. Which means that we are likely to see more of those male transgender athletes representing New Zealand at Commonwealth Games, Olympic Games, and on the national or international sports stage.
We're already seeing a number, but unfortunately, that's not made public. I mean, did you realise that the 11th NZ PWG Women's Golf Pro-Am was won by an Australian male transgender athlete called Brianna Gill? I think it was in 2018. And anyone that raised concerns with Golf New Zealand were told that Gill's biological sex had to remain confidential in line with their policy, and they couldn't disclose it.
Oh, you're joking.
We've been contacted. No, I wish I was, Michael. This is why it's not discussed. Everyone is so scared. And, we have the example of what happened with Leah Thomas, the US college swimmer, who soared from a mid-500 ranking in the men's competition to being the top-ranked women's swimmer, reaching the finals of 3 NCAA swimming championships and winning a gold medal. And the swimmers that tried to speak out about that were basically told that they could be provided counselling to deal with it. It's just madness. There's been a number of examples. We've got, Kate Weatherly in cycling. This is, New Zealand cycling again, ignoring the voices of women. Kate Weatherly went from being an average male downhill competitor at the end of 2018 to dominating the elite women's field in 2019. Females actually boycotted the national finals because of it, but the race still went ahead with a small field, which Weatherly won. One of the athletes who raced, who was brave enough to speak up, was Shania Rawson, who was a former junior world number 2. She posted on Facebook that cycling had always been a gender-specific sport, not a competition among individuals with hormone levels, and she'd worked really hard and committed to her life to sport, but never did she imagine she'd be faced with that. Her father, Ash Rawson, a 9-time BMX champion and coach, he questioned Cycling New Zealand about their decision, and they basically just said Shania should focus on her own performance. Like she could somehow mitigate that biological advantage that Weatherly had through her own performance. It was, utterly insulting. And given Cycling New Zealand's lack of support and mistreatment of female athletes, they should not be allowing this, yet they are. But it just simply highlights what's going on at the leadership and admin levels of sport, who are so out of touch with their athletes.
Well, that's the point that I was trying to make, I think, to do with Olivia Podmore and the recent cycling review. And it does seem that there is, and I'm just saying, there was a comment made by one of the male elite cyclists this morning saying, listen, you've got to deal with failure. If you're going to be an elite athlete, you've just got to deal with the fact that you're going to fail, and if you don't have the resilience.
And I think resilience in sport is incredibly important. It is part of sports. If you don't have it, you simply cannot be an elite athlete. But you don't. But when you fail because of something that is so
it's outside of your control,
is completely outside of your control.
Yeah.
There is nothing you can do about your performance to change that failure. It's just wrong.
Can I ask a question then of you? Do you think that the reason that these sports have embraced male transgender athletes is because of their desire to win medals? I mean, let's be honest about it. Laurel Hubbard was, I think, the favourite in the heavyweight version of the Commonwealth Games. We all saw what happened. It was unfortunate. But she, going into that particular tournament, was the favourite. And she was going to win a gold medal for New Zealand. Do you think Weightlifting New Zealand cared as long as it was a gold medal?
No, I don't think that that's the case. I just think that, sports have been captured by activists, and it started from the IOC when they changed their rules from requiring testosterone reduction to now they've got basically anyone can compete in the division that they want, and sports have to prove that there isn't an advantage. So it started with poor leadership at IOC level, ignoring women's voices for years and years on this issue.
I understand. I understand what you're saying. Ro, I understand the IOC, and that's fine. But for New Zealand, I mean, and that's who you commissioned. You found out what New Zealanders thought. Does it require some form of direction at a national level? I'm talking about a legislative level. You talked about Grant Robertson, the Minister of Sport. Or does it require, because it seems to me that sports in New Zealand are scared. You've mentioned fear. I think that's what motivates them not to make this an issue and not to do anything about it. So does it?
So we heard from rugby unions around the world when World Rugby Guidelines came out. There was an orchestrated campaign to push them to reject them. And they were fearful, and they decided that, there was a lot of unions that decided that it just simply wasn't worth the kickback from activists, and there'd be so few male transgender players that it just, they should just let it go through. Wasn't an issue. And I think that is a huge part of the problem, is that this is such a contentious issue. It's,
I'm sorry, but the first 90 kilogram, I was just going to say Samoan because they're such muscled athletes, but the first 90 kg athlete that transitions into being a woman or self-identifies as a woman, boy oh boy, I mean, they're going to hurt people, aren't they?
Yeah, well, we've already had that happen. There was a high school game, sorry, I can't recall the country, but it was somewhere in the Pacific. They had a high school game where male transgender athletes were allowed to play in the female division, and 3 players within one team were injured. The coach spoke up about it, and, they're trying to push things back now. But this is the problem, that sports are waiting for injuries to happen to females. Females have to wear consequences before they do anything. It's, we look at what happened with the British cyclist Emily Bridges recently. I don't know if you were up to date with that issue, but Emily Bridges, male transgender athlete, who was winning gold and bronze medals in men's events at university games, a month before he wanted to transition and compete in the female division against female British Olympians who had won silver in Tokyo. And the times that Bridges was getting at the university games were faster. But it was so obvious that no amount of testosterone reduction was going to mitigate the Bridges' advantage, but it was only because elite female athletes, these Olympians, stood up and said, this is not okay. It was literally the first time that the British cycling's transgender policy was put under any pressure, and it was found wanting. So now they're reviewing it. But prior to that, anyone who raised concerns was told to turn a blind eye to science and biology and just to keep quiet and suck it up.
No, I understand that. I guess one argument that could run the other way, though, is that when you get into elite sport, the kind of people that are in elite sport are physically advantaged over the rest of the population anyhow, aren't they? Can I give you an example? I had a lovely conversation with a very dear lesbian friend of mine and said, why are lesbians so good at sport? And she said, I think, there might be some physical advantages that we enjoy. I don't know. Is there something in the physiology of people anyhow within the genders that means that you're advantaged by, I don't know. You're just born gifted athletically? Well,
you could be. I guess nature and nurture, it's hard to know really, isn't it?
Well, no, but surely it's nature. I mean, I could train. My son is a really good example. He loves football. He's obsessed by it. He trains all the time, but he'll never become a top footballer because at the end of the day, it's the athletic ability of other 13 and 14-year-olds that will make them elite athletes, isn't it, really? I mean, there's nothing I could do to make myself an elite athlete.
Yeah. Yeah, true. But what I think is really important to understand about this whole debate is this is just as important at a community level in sport as it is at elite level. Community level is our pipeline.
Yeah.
And, we were contacted not long ago by the mother of an 11-year-old who has been impacted by this already in her sport. So this is happening at all levels of sport across New Zealand, and we need to make sure female participation levels already drop off dramatically in teenage years.
Yeah, I guess,
male bodies
you make a good point.
We're just going to lose females from sport, and we'll lose these amazing elite female athletes who are just absolute legends and inspire other females to do the same, and we just can't risk doing that.
Okay, now then it seems, I don't know why, but it's an odd thing in my lifetime, Ro, that suddenly it's become fashionable, fetish, I don't know, to become a transitional gender person. It didn't happen 40 years ago, obviously, when I was growing up. My daughter's generation now...
It's no longer cool to be, just white and straight, is it?
No.
It's all about, being some kind of, minority that's disadvantaged. We've made that cool. It's just
we have
so
indeed.
sad.
And it's become, I don't know, fetish, fashionable, I don't know, maybe they've always been, it's a bit like the sort of homosexual debate of 30 years ago. You've always said, well, wow, this is all unusual, and then suddenly, no, we've accepted, and that's just the way I are, and you're born that way.
I would disagree with that, because if that was the case, we've got this exponential rise in young girls identifying as non-binary and trans boys. Where are all the women in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, all of a sudden transitioning because they didn't feel comfortable before? They're not there.
So you're saying that it's a societal pressure or encouragement to become a transitional gender.
And it's a social contagion. Unfortunately with females, we have them, like I think about when I was young, it was bulimia and anorexia.
Yep.
Then it was cutting, and now it's transitioning. It's really unfortunate. I'm not saying that all of them are affected by this, but, there's been research done that shows that a large number are. And if one girl in a friend group transitions, then it's highly likely that other girls in her friend group will too, because it's just the way females work.
Ro, you have given us enormous food for thought. This is well beyond just trans folk involving themselves in sport. And some of your comments at the end there, I think, should... let's discuss it. Can I thank you so much for coming on the show this morning, raising these issues, and please, I hope you'll continue to do so.
Oh, look, I'd love to, and thank you so much for the opportunity. It's actually lovely to have a station that welcomes a debate like this, because
can I just quickly, do you find that you're not getting any coverage from mainstream media, or that...
It's incredibly hard, and if they do, if I put out a press release and try to get some coverage on an issue, I might get one journalist come back, and it's all about trying to find ways to attack us. And, so there's some journalists now, I've stopped putting out press releases to them because we just don't get anywhere. They're just not interested, and the only time we've got coverage is when we had over 17 New Zealand elite athletes sign a letter to Grant Robertson, and we presented that to Parliament. Other than that, they don't want to know. They're as scared of this issue as our sporting leaders are.
Thank you so much for joining us, Ro. We'll talk to you again sometime in the future, I hope.